7 years after Man of Steel, Kevin Costner and Diane Lane played another couple in this gritty neo-Western drama. The Western genre is having a renaissance in the 2020s, partly due to Taylor Sheridan and John Linson's hit series Yellowstone, which has expanded into its own universe. Kevin Costner starred in the majority of the series as John Dutton, the tough-as-nails, ultra-masculine patriarch protecting his family's ranch from land developers and other conflicts. But Yellowstone wasn't Costner's first rodeo in the Western or neo-Western genre, nor was it his last. Costner is tied to the Western genre through several films, multi-season series, and limited series. However, Costner has more than once dabbled in other genres as well. One of his most mainstream films in the past 15 years was Man of Steel, the first installment of the DC Extended Universe, where he played Jonathan Kent, Superman/Clark Kent's adoptive father. Starring beside him as Martha Kent was Diane Lane, an Academy Award-nominated actor known for her versatility. Man of Steel wasn't the only time Costner and Lane stole the screen together as an adored couple. The actors later starred in an underrated neo-Western film titled Let Him Go in 2020. Let Him Go isn't Hollywood's typical Western. Neo-Western films are defined by their contemporary settings that still use themes and tropes from the Old West. Let Him Go finds a good sweet spot between the outdated motifs of the Old West and the progressiveness of the modern day to tell a story that fits any time period. Taking place in the early 1960s in Montana and North Dakota, Let Him Go begins with a tragedy. James, the son of Costner and Lane's characters George and Margaret Blackledge, dies after falling off his horse and breaking his neck. Other than his parents, James is survived by his wife, Lorna, and their infant son, Jimmy. Conflict arises later when Lorna marries her new boyfriend, Donnie Weeboy, purely out of support for Jimmy. Although initially supportive of the marriage, Margaret discovers that Donnie is abusive to both Lorna and Jimmy and convinces George to rescue their grandson when the family turns up missing. After tracking down Lorna, they learn that both her and Jimmy have been staying with Donnie's family, an infamous family known for their violence in North Dakota. Most of the film acts as a revenge saga that's reminiscent of old Western notions that draw on a character's struggle between choosing right from wrong. Both Margaret and George try to do right by their grandson, their only living blood relative and a reminder of their son left, but find themselves incompetent in their efforts. The film is also a nice twist on the us versus the law and civilization trope that is commonly found in older Westerns and even neo-Westerns like Yellowstone. Margaret and George, who is a retired sheriff, are considered civilized people in comparison to the Weeboys, who live off the grid and have a shoot first, think later mentality. But because the local police have connections to the Weeboys, Margaret and George are forced to rescue Jimmy on their own terms. Let Him Go doesn't rely on gunfights or land disputes for its conflict. The plot device that is probably most associated with the Western genre is the gunfight. Whether it's two men agreeing to a duel over a generations-old blood feud or a drunken bar brawl, guns are always firing in older and modern Western stories. The same can be said for Let Him Go, to a degree. The final act takes place in the Weeboys' house after George intrudes the home to rescue Lorna and Jimmy once and for all. But there's nothing clean about this fight. The fire George sets outside eventually finds its way to the house, engulfing it in flames. George proceeds to hold off the family member with a gun, but everyone's aim is slightly terrible, given everyone is riled up and tired. At one point, the matriarch Blanche accidentally shoots her own son dead. But the final fight wasn't even the scene that delivered the most thrilling moment of the movie. In an earlier scene, the Weeboys confront the Blackledges over their secret meetings with Lorna at her job. Blanche uses her twisted power to slap Donnie, presumably letting Lorna and George believe that he'll be punished for abusing his wife and stepson. Blanche turns the table on the couple and instead orders Donnie to chop off George's fingers as a warning. Torture scenes aren't terribly common in Westerns, as most cowboys just get the job done. The mutilation of George puts Let Him Go on a similar level as Ozark or Breaking Bad by displaying a slow act of torment against one of the film's heroes. It's a moment of violence that is so brazen that it almost makes viewers forget how this conflict escalated so quickly in the first place. This fresh feud between these two families isn't about a land dispute, which is a classic but overused trope in westerns. Nobody is fighting over who owns what land according to ancestral history or the law. At the center of this conflict is the custody of a young boy, likely so unfazed because he doesn't realize what's happening around him. The film hardly ever uses the words kidnapping or captured, which, by definition, is what the wee boys did to Jimmy because of Lorna's lack of power. But Margaret feels an immense sense of urgency because the film explicitly shows abuse and acts of violence committed by the wee boys, as well as the law's fear of the family to demonstrate their danger. The neo-Western film uproots racist and sexist tropes in the genre. Let Him Go is subtle in the way it explores its concepts of family and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. There's nothing ostentatious about its presentation, allowing the big performances and the rare moments of violence to catapult its simplicity into something grand. Let Him Go is, for the most part, an ordinary story that ditches the racist and misogynistic tropes of the Western genre. Boo Boo Stewart plays the only Indigenous character in the story as a young man named Peter Dragswolf that Margaret and George encounter on their journey. Peter's hardships aren't at the forefront of the film by any means, but his loneliness and sadness toward his situation is greatly reflective of the conditions many Indigenous nations were forced to live during that time. Nevertheless, his characterization is far from perfect. He's a stand-in for everything Margaret and George miss after their son's death, and acts more as a guide, both literally and spiritually. The greatest thing the film achieves is Margaret's arc, who feels more like the protagonist than George. Margaret is a relatable individual who is driven by her instincts as a mother and an empathetic human being. George is more passive in his approach to his grandson's circumstances, uplifting her as the flawed hero. Her weaknesses are rooted in the societal expectations of the 1960s that people scoff at today, but were the difficult norms of that time. Case in point, Margaret is far more concerned with Jimmy's well-being than Lorna, who is being equally abused. Margaret comes off a little hypocritical in the way she speaks about Lorna, believing her lack of a backbone to stand up to Donnie makes her an unfit mother. But Margaret overcomes this old-fashioned attitude in the end after she fails to save George. Margaret realizes that she's not this invulnerable shield that can protect everyone in her family, just like Lorna isn't. Lorna was in an impossible situation to escape and only entered it because she was expected to marry again to find a father for he.